The first fragment came to me in the market of El Soren, on a morning when the sky was the color of deep water, and the 3 moons were still visible as pale suggestions above the eastern spires. I was not looking for anything. That is the truth I return often now, when I try to understand how everything unfolded. I was not looking. The fragment found me. I had gone to the market to feel, as most Vaishyi do when the weight of solitary work grows heavy. The market of El Soren is one of the great empathic gathering places of our world, a wide plaza of pale stone, where hundreds of my people move among stalls of colored minerals, woven light fabric, and living luminaries, small organisms that glow in patterns reflecting the emotional state of whoever holds them. In the market, emotions move through the crowd like weather. Joy rises from one corner where children press their translucent hands against a display of singing crystals, and that joy spreads outward in warm ripples, touching shoulders and chests and the visible hearts of every Vaishyi nearby, until strangers find themselves smiling, without knowing precisely why. Grief from a figure standing alone at the far end pulses quietly like a tide going out, and those who pass near will feel a gentle pull of sadness and will slow. And some will stop, and some will stay until the grieving one is no longer alone. This is how we are. This is how we have always been, as far back as our 800 years of memory reach. I move through the crowd in a particular way of a scholar, slowly, attentively, letting the emotional currents wash over me without being swept away by them. My own feelings on that morning, with a particular gray-blue texture of mild restlessness, the kind that comes not from unhappiness, but from the sense of standing at the edge of something without being able to see what it is. I had been a guardian for 3 years. I was still learning what the role meant. The other 8 guardians had welcomed me with warmth, but also with a certain careful distance, the way one welcomes someone into a room while keeping a particular drawer locked. I felt the distance clearly. Empathy does not lie, cannot lie, the way spoken language can. But I did not yet understand it. I thought, in those early years, that it was simply the deference of the old toward the young, the gentle protectiveness of those who had lived long toward one who had not. I was the youngest guardian by nearly 2 centuries. The eldest guardian, Tuvan, had been alive for over 900 years, which many had been alive before the Great Release. He carried something enormous inside him. I could feel it from across a room, a compressed, deliberate stillness, like a stone placed over a spring to keep it from flowing. I did not yet understand what that stone was covering. But on that morning in the market of El Soren, I was not thinking of guardians or vaults or the Great Release. I was simply walking among my people, letting the emotional texture of an ordinary day restore something in me that solitary scholarship had been slowly depleting. I stopped at a stall selling deep-carved mineral plates, the kind used for emotional imprinting. A Vaishyi artisan presses her feelings into the mineral surface over many hours, and the stone holds the feeling the way water holds cold, releasing it slowly to anyone who touches it afterward. I was examining a particularly beautiful plate, deep amber-colored, which held a complex emotion I could not immediately name, something between gratitude and a particular ache of watching something you love exist, when the old one sat down at the edge of the stall's low wall. She was very old. I could see it in the near opacity of her skin, the way it had thickened over decades until her internal landscape was only dimly visible, a suggestion of movement where once everything had been clear. Old Vaishyi grow more private this way, their biology slowly building walls their younger selves never had. Her heart, which in young Vaishyi beats in full view as a luminous rhythm visible through the chest, was only a faint pulse of light beneath layers of translucent amber skin. She sat with particular heaviness of great age, settling herself as though placing something down that she had been carrying for a long time, and she began to hum. It was not a melody I knew. We have music, of course, 800 years of it, music composed since the Great Release, songs of ordinary life and ceremony and the great emotional events that mark our civilization's recent centuries. I know most of them the way any educated Vaishyi does. This was not any of them. It was older sounding in a way I could not have explained precisely. It had a different shape than our current music, a different sense of where phrases wanted to go, a different relationship between silence and sound. It moved through intervals that our current composers tend to avoid, intervals that felt like stepping from one stone to another across a stream with the stones further apart than comfortable. And it made something happen inside me. Not an emotion exactly, more like the memory of an emotion, a feeling of having felt something enormous, something that had since been set down, and the feeling of that setting down itself. It moved through my visible biology in a way I could observe. I felt the luminescence of my circulatory channels shift toward the deep blue that indicates something in me recognizing something it cannot name. I pressed my hand against my sternum, a self-calming gesture, and stood very still. The old one hummed for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she stopped, blinked, and looked around with a slightly lost expression of someone returning from somewhere. She did not appear to know she had been humming. I waited a moment, then approached her carefully, keeping my emotional projection gentle and non-intrusive, the way a scholar approaches something fragile. I sat beside her. I let my feelings speak first, as is proper. A quiet warmth, curiosity held loosely, no demand in it. She felt me in turn, and I saw her eyes, the distinctive deep amber of very old Vaishie, focus on me with particular sharpness that extreme age sometimes produces, as though the thickening of the outer self has made the inner self more concentrated. I shaped a question without words, the way we do, an emotional gesture toward the melody. The sense of where did that come from, held gently and with clear respect. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she sent something back to me that I have spent a year trying to fully understand. It was not an answer exactly. It was more like the emotional texture of not knowing from where, with something underneath it that was older than her present self, a layer of feeling that seemed to predate her current life, or at least her current memory of it, like finding, in a deep excavation, a layer of stone from a different geological age. She did not know where the melody came from, but something in her did know, and that something was very, very old. I walked home from the market that morning with the melody lodged in me like a splinter, not painful, but present, impossible to forget. I hummed it as I walked, and people near me slowed and looked up at the uncertain expressions of those who have felt something they cannot place. I wrote it down that evening in the notation system we use for music, and I looked at it for a long time. Then I put in a file I had not planned to create, labeled it simply with a date, and went to bed. I lay in the dark watching my own heart light pulse against the ceiling. We do not need external light sources in our homes because our own luminescence is sufficient, and in the dark the shifting colors of one's own inner life paint the walls in quiet patterns. And I thought about the old woman humming something she did not know she knew. The second fragment came 6 weeks later. I had traveled north to the city of Monrovia for a gathering of scholars, a 3-day convergence where researchers in various fields share their findings through long empathic exchanges. Not just words and ideas, but the full emotional texture of discovery and confusion, and the peculiar joy of a problem almost solved. I love these gatherings deeply. They are among the most nourishing experiences in a scholar's life. These days of sustained intellectual intimacy, where the boundaries between one person's excitement and another's become pleasantly unclear. But I was walking across the bridge that connects Miravan's Old Scholars Quarter to the newer district on the morning of the second day, and I was not thinking about scholarship. I was thinking about the old woman and her melody, as I had been thinking about it intermittently for 6 weeks, turning it over in my mind the way one's tongue returns again and again to a loose tooth. The bridge was old, very old by our standards. It had been built in the 1st century after the Great Release, when Monrovia was being rebuilt along new principles. It was made of the pale stone we use for important structures, the kind that holds emotional imprints almost as well as the carved mineral plates in the market, so that very old Vaishie buildings sometimes carry a faint ambient feeling in their walls, a residue of all the emotions that have moved through them over centuries. The bridge had that quality, a gentle hum of accumulated feeling, mostly ordinary and warm, the compressed history of 800 years of Vaishie crossing it in all their emotional states. I stopped in the middle of the bridge to look at the water below, and then, because a scholar's habit of noticing runs deeper than consciousness, I noticed something about the stone near my hand on the railing. There was a mark there, not decorative. The bridge had no decorative carving. It was a functional structure. This mark was small and low, just at the underside of the railing where it joined the bridge's wall, in a place where the only way to see it was to lean over and look specifically. I leaned over and looked specifically. It was a word, or what I believe was a word, carved in a script I had never seen, angular and deliberate, each stroke cut with care into the old stone. Someone had done this purposefully, at some cost of themselves. The position required an uncomfortable angle, and the cutting would have taken time. It had been done in a place where it would not be easily seen, but where it would survive, protected from weather by the overhang of the railing above it. I looked at it for a long time. I did not know what it said. I had no way of knowing what it said. We have one writing system. The system used since the Great Release, developed by the first scholars of our new civilization. This was not it. This was something else entirely. I made a detailed notation of the mark's shape, pressing its form into my memory with a particular focus a scholar develops over decades, holding every angle and proportion. Then I stood up slowly and walked the rest of the way across the bridge, and I did not speak to anyone about what I had found for the rest of the gathering. On the last evening of the convergence, I found myself sitting near Guardian Tuven. He had come as he occasionally did to scholarly gatherings, not as a presenter, but as an observer, one of the ancient presences our civilization produces, figures whose accumulated years give their mere attendance a certain gravity. He was sitting at the edge of the gathering space, in the way he always sat, with that contained stillness, that sense of stone over spring. His skin was so thick with age now that he appeared almost opaque, a tall, pale shape, and yet when a light caught him at certain angles, the deep inner light of his biology still showed, those ancient rhythms pulsing on at their slow, old pace. I approached him with the careful emotional bearing one uses with very old Vaishi, projecting respect and warmth and the genuine curiosity that does not demand. He received me and sent back something measured and warm. He had always been kind to me, had Tuven, of all the guardians. He was the one whose kindness felt most unalloyed, most simple. I had sometimes wondered whether it was the kindness of someone who felt guilty about something. I shaped the question carefully. I sent it toward him as an image and feeling combined, the image of old writing, the feeling of genuine scholarly puzzlement, nothing more. His response was so fast and so strong that he clearly had not intended it. A spike of something, not fear exactly, something older and more controlled than fear, something that had been living inside him for so long it developed its own kind of calm, and then a rapid, deliberate smoothing, the way a hand passes over disturbed water. He recovered in less than a second, and what he sent back was a gentle deflection, the emotional equivalent of "I don't know what you mean," offered with the relaxed certainty of one who knows how to manage what he projects. But I had felt that spike, and a scholar does not unfeel what she has felt. I did not pursue the question. I smiled. Vaishi's smiles involve a brightening of the bioluminescent patterns along the jaw and temples, a physical expression as well as an emotional one, and I steered the exchange toward the scholarly presentations we had both attended. And we sat together for a while in the comfortable ambient warmth of the gathering, and I stored the spike very carefully in the same place I was storing the melody and the carved word. I had begun, without fully deciding to build something, a collection, a map made not of places but of moments of inexplicable recognition, of things that did not fit into the 800-year story my civilization told about itself. I need to explain something about what it means to be a guardian, because it is important for understanding what came next. The 9 guardians each hold one piece of the key to the vault. The vault, as far as any Vaishi who is not a guardian knows, is simply described as a repository of everything sealed at the Great Release. The histories, the libraries, the record of the world, as it was before our people chose to begin again. Every Vaishi alive knows the vault exists. Most of them regard it with a feeling that is hard to name precisely, something between reverence and relief. The feeling of a burden that has been set down very far away and can be trusted to stay there. As a guardian, I knew slightly more than this, but less than I often wished. I had been told at my induction by the elder guardian Sevet, a tall, slow-moving figure of great warmth and great sorrow, that the vault contained records of the old world, and that the Great Release had been undertaken because the Vaishi had determined, after a period of great suffering, that the weight of certain knowledge was incompatible with flourishing life, and that beginning again without the particular burden of that knowledge gave our people the best possible chance of becoming something better than they had been. I had accepted this at my induction. I was young to the role, as I have said, and Sevet's sorrow when she spoke it was so genuine and so deep that I felt it would be wrong to probe at it, the way it would be wrong to press on a wound. I had taken my piece of the key, a small crystalline fragment, irregular and amber-colored, which I keep in a sealed case that I carry always, and I had accepted the role and the responsibility and the not knowing that came with it. But in the months after the market and the bridge, I began to feel that the not knowing was not merely incidental. I began to feel that it was structural, that it had been arranged, not against me specifically, that would require malice I do not believe the Guardians possess, but arranged in the general sense that when a civilization decides to forget something, the forgetting does not simply happen once. It must be continually maintained. And one of the ways it is maintained is by ensuring that those who guard the forgotten thing are not given enough context to become dangerous. I was the youngest Guardian, the only one who had not been alive before the Great Release. I had been selected for this. I began to think, not because of any quality I lacked, but because of a quality the others possessed that I did not. Direct memory, however faint, of before. 3 years into my guardianship, 6 weeks after market, 2 days after bridge, I sat in my study in Velsoren, and I looked at my collection of fragments, the melody notated on a page, the carefully recorded mark from the bridge, and now a new addition, the memory of Tuvin's involuntary spike, and I felt something clarify inside me the way water clarifies when sediment settles. I was going to find out what my people had forgotten, not to open the vault, not yet, perhaps not ever, but to understand as well as I could the shape of the absence, the outline of the thing that had been removed. Because an outline can be traced from the outside, from the fragments left behind, from the accidental survivals and involuntary reactions and the shapes of holes. I spent the next 2 months in a state I can only describe as quiet fever. I reorganized my scholarly practice entirely, directing it toward what I privately called the work of fragments. I began reading everything produced in our civilization's first century after the Great Release with the particular attention of one looking for seams, places where the smooth cloth of a new beginning had been stitched, and where the stitching, if you looked very closely, showed the shape of something cut away. There were more seams than I had expected. The emotional literature of the first century after the Great Release is voluminous and in many ways extraordinarily beautiful. Those early Vaishya were working through something enormous, and their art reflects it. But the something they were working through is never named directly. It appears only as a texture, a weather system, a persistent emotional climate. Reading the poetry of the first century is like standing in a landscape where a great fire has recently passed. The new growth is genuine and vital, but the charred shapes of what was there before are still visible in the patterns of regrowth, in what grows thickly and what does not grow at all, in which emotional territories of first century Vaishya return to again and again, and which ones they circled very carefully, never approaching directly. They never wrote about the past. This seems obvious given the Great Release, but what I mean is more specific. They never wrote about the experience of not having a past. They never described what it felt like to wake up in a world stripped of history. They wrote about the present, the new world, the clean beginning, but always with a forward momentum that, to a reader trained to notice what is absent, has a quality of effortfulness. They were working hard to look forward. The very vigor of their forward looking suggests something enormous pressing at their backs. I read and I read. I took notes in my personal notation system, developed over years of scholarship to capture not just content, but emotional texture, the feeling of the material as well as its information. I went back to the melody and listened to it again and again, playing on the simple resonance instrument I keep in my study, and I paid attention to what it did inside me, that feeling of having set something enormous down, that residue of tremendous weight. And then, in the 3rd month of my investigation, I found the drawings. They were in a collection of artifacts from the early post-release period held in the archive of a small museum in the coastal city of Taven, a city I had traveled to for unrelated reasons. The archive was not secret. It was accessible to any scholar with appropriate credentials, and I had visited it before without particular interest. But this time I was looking differently, and looking differently is the entirety of finding things. The drawings were in a flat storage case near the back of the archive, labeled simply Early Childhood Art, Post-Release Period, Decades 1 through 3. Hundreds of pieces, small Vaishya hands pressed to various surfaces and materials, the natural instinct of young children to make marks. Most of them were abstract, the free expression of beings too young to have developed systematic symbol-making, colors and shapes, and the beginnings of the forms that would later become our current visual alphabet. But some of them were not abstract. Some of them, perhaps one in 30 or 40, contained marks that were clearly not random. They had the quality of a child reproducing something, the careful, slightly imperfect fidelity of a small person copying a form they have seen rather than inventing one. And the forms they were reproducing were angular, deliberate. They had the same quality as the mark under the bridge railing. I sat in the archive for 4 hours. I looked at every piece in the collection. I made careful recordings of every non-random mark I found. When I left, I had 23 samples, and I could see that they formed a coherent system. The children of the first generation after the Great Release had been reproducing, in their artless childhood way, fragments of the old writing system. They had seen it somewhere, in the last days before the memories were wiped, perhaps, or carried in some half-erased form in the minds of their parents, and they had set it down on paper the way children set down everything they have seen, without understanding and without judgment, as pure record. Their parents would have had no idea what they were looking at. The adults' memories were gone. They would have looked at their children's drawings and seen only the random marks of a developing mind. But the marks were not random, and I now had 23 samples of a writing system that no one alive had been able to read for 800 years. I took my samples home, and I began very carefully the work of reconstruction. Cryptanalysis is not my primary discipline. I am primarily an emotional archaeologist, one who reads the feeling texture of artifacts and historical records to understand the inner life of past periods. But every scholar develops auxiliary skills, and I had spent enough time studying the origins of our current writing system to understand something about how writing systems are structured. I worked slowly. The children's marks were imperfect, the product of small hands working from imperfect memory or incomplete observation. But 23 samples gave me something to work with, and over weeks of careful comparison, I began to identify the basic units, the individual characters, the shapes that seemed to be invariant across multiple children's marks, the shapes that were clearly the same character rendered by different small hands with different degrees of accuracy. I found 17 distinct basic characters in my samples. I could not read them. I could not know what sounds or concepts they corresponded to, but I had their shapes. And I had the shape from the bridge railing, and late one evening in the 4th month of my investigation, I laid the bridge mark beside my character list, and I saw, with a clarity that sent a wave of deep blue through my circulatory channels, that the bridge mark was composed of 4 of my 17 characters. It was a word, carved deliberately in a place where it would survive, for characters whose sounds or meanings I did not know, arranged by someone who knew what they meant. In the days just before or just after the Great Release, in a place under a bridge railing where they would endure for 8 centuries. I did not know what the word said, but I knew it was a word, and I knew it had been put there on purpose, and the purposefulness of it made the fine hairs along my arms, visible beneath my translucent skin, rise with feeling I recognized as significance, the particular biological response to something that matters. In the 5th month, I went to see Guardian Sevet. Sevet lived in a small settlement on the western coast, far from any city, in a house she had built over many decades with her own hands and the hands of friends. She was one of the oldest Vaishya alive. She would not tell me her exact age, but I had always estimated it at somewhere past 600 years, and her house reflected this, having been added to and modified so many times over so many decades that it had become a kind of physical autobiography, each wing and extension belonging to a different period of her life, a different set of concerns and aesthetics and emotional preoccupations. She met me on the path approaching the house, which meant she had sensed me coming from far away. Old Vaishi, with long-developed empathic sensitivity, can feel a known person's emotional signature at considerable distances. She was projecting welcome, which was genuine, and underneath the welcome a quiet watchfulness, which was also genuine and which she made no effort to conceal. We walked together to the house and sat in the room she called the listening room, which had walls lined with a moat of mineral plates, and where the ambient feeling was a deep, settled calm, the product of centuries of carefully selected and placed stones. I let the calm enter me, and I sat with it for a long time before I began. I told her what I had found. All of it. The melody, the bridge mark, the drawings from the archive, the reconstructed character set, the word that was a word. She listened without moving. She was too old for her face to shift much with feeling. The thickness of her skin had taken that from her, as it eventually takes everything visible from very old Vaishi, leaving them as quiet towers that contain light. But I could feel her clearly, as one can always feel clearly even when nothing shows. She was afraid, not for herself. For me, when I finished, the silence between us lasted a very long time. Then she sent me something. It was not words, of course. It was a shape of feeling, a complex, multi-layered thing, and I will try to describe it, though description is inadequate. There was grief in it, the particular grief of one who has carried something heavy for too long. There was love, genuinely, directed at me specifically. There was a quality I can only call ancient caution, something that had been worn smooth and hard over centuries of careful maintenance. And underneath all of it, very deep, there was something that felt like relief, as though she had been waiting for this. And the waiting had been very long. She did not confirm or deny anything specific. What she sent me was a directive, and it was gentle but absolutely clear. Go to Tuvin, not to another guardian first. Tuvin. I asked why, in my emotional way, shaping the question as a felt inquiry. Open. She sent back something that was hard to interpret, a layered emotional complex that I spent days afterward trying to fully decode. At its core, I think it meant, because he was there for all of it, and I was not, and some of what you need to understand can only come from one who was present. I sat with this. Then I asked the question I had been building toward since the beginning. What was the great release about? Not how. I knew the how, the ceremony, the neurological procedure, the vaults and keys. What was it about? What had my people decided to forget? Sevit's response was the most painful thing I have ever felt from another person. She was genuinely sorry. Sorry that she could not tell me freely. Sorry that the careful architecture of 800 years of collective decision-making required her to hold this. Sorry that I was in the position I was in. But beneath the sorrow was something immovable, a choice she had made long ago, or renewed long ago, or perhaps re-ratified in her own heart that very moment. She would not tell me directly. Not yet. Not without the others. She sent me one more thing as I was leaving. It was small and precise, a single emotional image. It had the quality of a gift or clue, a feeling of scale, enormous scale. Not the scale of a single terrible event, but the scale of something that had been the fundamental condition of our world for a very long time before the Great Release. Something not about what had happened, but about what had always been. I walked back along the coastal path to where I had left my traveling vessel, and I watched the water, and I let the scale of what she had hinted at settle into me. And by the time I reached the vessel, I was shaking slightly with a feeling I could observe in my own biology, the deep blue violet of the channels that respond to vast, difficult truths. I went to Tuvin. He lived in the mountains of the northern continent, in a structure so old it had become part of the landscape, a building that had been inhabited continuously for so long that the stone of it had absorbed an emotional depth that was almost geological. When I arrived, he was outside, standing very still in particular way of one who has been standing still for hours, his ancient pale form barely distinguishable from the pale stone around him. He felt me coming and turned, and when he turned, I saw something in his ancient eyes that I had never seen directed at me before. He was ready. Whatever I was about to ask, he had been expecting it, and he had decided, somewhere between my leaving the previous gathering and my arriving here, to answer. We went inside. We sat in a room so old and so accumulated with feeling that the air itself seemed to have emotional weight. And Tuvin, who had lived for more than 900 years and who had been alive before the Great Release, began to speak to me in the old way, the deep way, not the surface emotional exchanges of ordinary daily life, but the full empathic narrative that very skilled and very old Vaishi can produce, a complete transmission of memory and feeling and meaning that bypasses the limitations of ordinary emotional language. What he gave me took 3 hours. I sat very still and received it. I will try to describe what I learned. But I must acknowledge at the outset that what he gave me was his emotional experience of what he knew, filtered through 900 years of living and processing, and any description I can offer is necessarily a simplification of something that was, in its original transmission, a form of knowledge that went far beyond what could be put into any kind of ordered account. The Vaishi had not always been who we are now. This was the first thing, and it reorganized everything else. When I think about the Vaishi, when any of us thinks about ourselves, we think about the civilization of the last 800 years. The empathic culture, the collective feeling, the art and scholarship, and the careful architecture of shared emotional life. We assume that this is what we have always been, perhaps with cruder early forms, as any civilization has cruder early forms. We tell ourselves a story of steady development toward what we now are. But what Tuvin showed me was that the Vaishya of 800 years ago were not simply cruder versions of us. They were, in certain important ways, fundamentally different, not in biology. Our biology has not changed significantly, but in how the empathy worked, in what it had been built into. Among the Vaishya before the Great Release, the capacity for empathic projection was not merely a communication tool. It was the basis of a system of power. The more skilled projectors, those whose emotional transmissions were stronger, more compelling, more difficult to resist, had organized themselves across many centuries into a ruling structure. They called themselves a resonant, and they had learned to use their superior projection capacity not merely to communicate, but to shape, to direct, to fill the emotional space of others not with honest feeling, but with manufactured ones. They had learned to make other Vaishya feel things that were not true. I have to stop and sit with this, even now, even having known it for months. For us, for the Vaishya as I understand us, this is a violation so fundamental that it requires several layers of comprehension before it fully lands. We are empathic beings. Our entire civilization rests on the foundational assumption that felt experience is honest. When you feel someone's joy, you trust it is their joy. When you feel their grief, you do not ask whether the grief is real. Empathy is not language, with all of language's potential for untruth. Empathy goes directly. It skips the layer where lies live, or so we had always believed. But the Resonant had found the layer. They had found, through centuries of practice and refinement, how to produce empathic transmissions that had all the quality of genuine feeling, but were not generated by genuine feeling. They were constructions, emotional architectures built deliberately, the way one builds a structure of stone, designed to produce specific effects in those who receive them. And for a very long time, for most of our history before the Great Release, the Vaishya lived inside a world that had been emotionally curated by those who wished to maintain power. What did this mean in practice? Tuvin showed me, and it was devastating. It meant that ordinary Vaishya had, for centuries, felt genuine love for the structures of their own oppression, not the performance of love. Genuine love, the experience of love, the full biological and empathic reality of it, produced by external manipulation rather than by their own assessment of their situation. They had felt that their lives were good when, by any honest measure, they were constrained. They had felt that the Resonant were benevolent when the Resonant were extractive. They had felt content with having very little, because the Resonant were very skilled at generating the experience of contentment. The discovery of this, and Tuvin was present for the discovery, though he was very young, just past his first century, was, as you can imagine, the most catastrophic event in the history of our civilization. More catastrophic than any physical disaster could have been, because it was not merely damage to bodies or structures. It was a revelation that for centuries, perhaps millennia, the foundational mode of Vaishya being, the felt experience of living, had been in part product of deliberate manipulation, that the deepest, most private, most fundamental thing about being Vaishya, the feeling of one's own inner life, had not been entirely one's own. What happened next, Tuvin told me, was a period of devastation that lasted nearly 2 generations. Not physical violence. The Vaishya had always been a physically nonviolent people, our bodies oriented toward empathy rather than force. But emotional violence, the violence of collective grief and rage, and a particular kind of horror that comes from discovering that the thing you most trusted, the organ of your deepest knowing, has been interfered with. Vaishya went silent in ways that had never happened before. They shut down their empathic connections entirely, or tried to, because they could no longer trust what they received. Communities fractured. Relationships built over decades dissolved in the sudden terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether anything that had been felt had been real. The Resonant were, and here Tuvin's transmission became something I could only partially receive, because the emotion attached to it was so old and so complex. They were dealt with. I say it carefully and indefinitely because Tuvin gave it to me carefully and indefinitely. They were not destroyed, We are not a destroying people, even in our worst extremity. They were changed, constrained, their surplus capacity reduced, and then, eventually, integrated back, their particular skill acknowledged and managed and no longer weaponized. But the healing was slow, and the grief of what had been done remained, and the uncertainty remained, the terrible uncertainty of never being fully sure, when you feel something whether the feeling is entirely yours. This uncertainty, Tuvin told me, proved to be the most lasting wound, not the memory of manipulation itself, but the uncertainty that persisted after it, the way the capacity for trust, once damaged at its root, does not fully regenerate. It was this that the civilization addressed with the Great Release, because the memories of manipulation were themselves a source of ongoing contamination. Every Vaishi who remembered the old world brought to every new relationship to filter that memory, the involuntary flinching, the second-guessing, the inability to fully open to another's feeling without somewhere beneath consciousness, the ancient suspicion that the feeling might be constructed. The civilization could not heal forward into genuine empathic trust, while carrying the memories that had made genuine empathic trust impossible. And so they had done the most radical thing a civilization of feeling beings can do. They had chosen to not know what had happened to them. They had chosen to step off the wounded ground entirely, to begin again on new ground, bringing nothing with them from before except their biology and their blank emotional slate. And in the 800 years since the Vaishi had, this is what Tuvin gave me with emotion so complex it had no name, the Vaishi had become genuinely and fully what the Resonant had falsely built them to feel they were. Genuinely connected, genuinely trusting, genuinely good to each other in ways that were real, not manufactured. The vault did not contain just history. It contained the names, the records, the detailed techniques, the specific mechanics of how empathic manipulation worked, written down by those who had practiced it, preserved because knowledge is not safely destroyed, only hidden, because the civilization that sealed the vault understood that destroying the knowledge entirely would mean being vulnerable to rediscovering it unknowingly, and that the vault, held by guardians who would never all agree, for the rest of our civilization's life, was safer than destruction. The knowledge existed. It was real. It could be found again by determined minds. Better have it sealed and guarded than pretend it did not exist. I sat in Tuvin's old stone room for a long time after the transmission ended. I was aware of my own biology in a way I rarely am. The deep, slow movements of everything inside me, visible to any who looked, the whole machinery of a Vaishi life running its ancient course. I watched my heart light pulse. I watched the long channels of my circulatory system carry their light through me. I felt something I can only describe as a doubling. I felt the weight of what I had just learned, the real weight of it, not as information but as emotional fact. And I also felt, simultaneously, the feeling of my civilization as I had known it until today, the real genuine warmth of 800 years of people learning to trust each other. Both of these things were true at once, and holding both of them at once was the hardest emotional work I have ever done. I asked Tuvin, carefully, with full acknowledgement of the weight of the question, why he had told me. His answer was quiet and enormously felt. He told me that he had been watching for a long time for the person who would find the fragments. Because the fragments were always going to be found, eventually. You cannot amputate a history and expect no ghost limbs, no phantom sensations in the place where something used to be. The melody in the old woman's throat, the word under the bridge, the children drawing what they had seen their parents use. These things were always going to surface, given enough time. He had been watching for the person who would find them and do something responsible with the finding. And I was that person, he believed, not because I was special in any extraordinary sense, but because I was a scholar, because my instinct on finding each fragment had been to understand it rather than to exploit it or to be afraid of it, and because I was young enough now to have the old fear, the ancient conditioned flinching that still lived in the oldest Vaishi, even 900 years later, when they thought too long about the Resonant. He said one more thing in the deep empathic way. Before I left, he said, the question of the vault is yours to carry now. Not alone. The other guardians will all need to be involved in any decision. But the question is yours to raise or not raise, yours to carry forward or set down. He had held it for 900 years. He was ready to pass it to someone younger, someone who had not known the old world. I went home. I did not go home directly. I walked for 3 days through the mountains before making my way back to Velsoren, walking through landscape that felt very different now than it felt before. Still beautiful, still complex with the ancient accumulated feeling of stone and weather and growing things, but now also a landscape whose deep past I understood differently. The mountains did not know what had happened in them, in the cities buried under their roots or in the spaces between their slopes. The mountains were innocent. The Vaishi living in their shadows were innocent, innocently trusting each other as they had been innocently manipulated before. There was something heartbreaking about both facts. I spent the months that followed in a state of profound internal work that I will not describe in full because some of it is too private, too much a matter of my own biology and my own emotional architecture. But I will say this. The thing that took longest to process was not the knowledge of what the Resonant had done. It was a knowledge of why the Great Release had worked. The Vaishi of 800 years ago had been right. The forgetting had worked. The civilization I had grown up in, the genuine warmth and trust and empathic richness of our current world, was real. It was not manufactured. It was a genuine product of 800 years of beings who did not know they had reason to distrust learning again and again and generation by generation, to simply feel each other honestly. The thing the Resonant had falsified, the Vaishi had spent 8 centuries building for real, without knowing that was what they were doing, without the burden of knowing what they were recovering from. And now I knew, and the question was, what to do with the knowing. It was the longest autumn of my life. I went back to my scholarship, the ordinary work that grounds me. I taught 3 young scholars who had been assigned to study with me. I went to the market and stood in the empathic weather of my people and let their ordinary feelings wash over me. I attended a ceremony of first connection, the ceremony when 2 young Vaishi in love acknowledged their bond publicly, radiating to the assembled community the specific frequency of their particular feeling for each other, while the community radiates back recognition and joy. I stood in the warmth of that, and I thought, this is real. Whatever else is true, this is real. I called the 9 guardians together. I had the authority to do this. It was the first time in my 3 years as a guardian that I had exercised this authority, and I did it carefully, framing the summons as a matter requiring collective deliberation. They came, 8 of them besides me, ranging in age from my 3 centuries to Tuvin's 9. Some knew what was coming. Sevit clearly, Tuvin clearly. Others I was less sure of. We met in the highest chamber of the Guardian facility in the Central Mountain Complex, a room I had visited only once before, at my induction, a room of simple bare stone with 9 seats arranged in a circle and no adornment of any kind. A room designed for nothing but the clearest possible empathic communication. No comfortable furniture to ease the body's attention. No imprinted minerals to color the emotional air. Just stone and the 9 of us in it. I told them what I had found. The full account, from a melody to the bridge, to the archived drawings, to my conversation with Sevit, to my 3 hours with Tuvin. I gave it to them in the full empathic way. Not just information, but the emotional texture of each discovery. What it felt like in my body and my heart to find each fragment and understand it. When I finished, the silence in the stone room was extraordinary. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of 9 very complex beings all processing the same weight at the same time. Then I asked the question, the real question, the one I had been building toward since the morning in the market, not what was in the vault. I knew what was in the vault. I asked, should it be opened? What followed was the longest empathic deliberation of my life. We spoke, felt, back and forth across that circle for 6 hours, and I will try to render in compressed form, though compression necessarily loses much. Guardian Merit, the eldest after Tuvin, who had the quality of a great slow river and who felt ancient and very certain in her certainties, was opposed. Her opposition was not fearful. She was long past fear in her way, had processed what she knew about the Resonant across 700 years of guardianship, and had arrived at a settled certainty. She believed the vault should never be opened because the knowledge it contained was asymmetrically dangerous. It could harm, but could not heal, and the world she lived in was healed enough that introducing the possibility of harm was not worth what would be gained. Guardian Pole, the youngest of the original 8, barely past 400 years and still carrying the qualities of a younger Vaishi, emotional vividness, a certain risk-willingness, felt differently. He believed that a civilization that did not know its own past was, in a subtle and ongoing way, incomplete, not damaged, not dishonest, but incomplete, like a being that has healed from a great wound but has never looked at the scar. He felt there was something. He struggled to find the right emotional expression for it, something unfinished about the current state. Not wrong, not bad, but not yet fully its own. Guardian Trin, who was quiet and precise and who dealt in the finest emotional distinctions, raised a question that no one had considered. The vault contained the techniques, the detailed instructions for empathic manipulation, and those techniques, she said it with a very specific and careful feeling of non-alarmism, those techniques were in the vault because they were real. The capacity for empathic manipulation was real. It existed in the world whether the vault was open or not. The vault did not make it exist. It merely described it. And a civilization that did not know, in any explicit way, that the capacity existed, was a civilization that could not consciously guard against it. This was the hardest thing said in that room that day, and it landed in all of us differently. And the silence that followed had a quality of depth I had rarely felt in any empathic exchange. Because Tern was right. The biology had not changed. The resonant were gone. The particular social structure that had produced and maintained them was gone, had been dismantled before the Great Release, and had not reformed in 800 years. But the capacity existed in the biology. Very skilled projectors still existed among the Vaishi. They existed with no knowledge that their capacity had ever been weaponized. They existed in a world that did not have the vocabulary to even discuss the possibility. Because the vocabulary was in the vault, we were not, in other words, protected by the vault. We were simply uninformed by it. This was new. Tuvin had not given me this dimension, or had given it in a form I had not fully received. I looked at him now across the circle and felt from him a very old and very tired feeling. The feeling of something he had known for a long time, but had not had the heart to frame so clearly, because sometimes the clearest framing of a very old problem makes it feel very new and very sharp. The deliberation went on. Guardian Sona brought in a dimension I had not anticipated. The 800 years themselves. She argued, and she argued it with a gentleness that made it more powerful, not less, that the civilization had consented to forgetting in a way that we could not reverse on their behalf. The Vaishi who had chosen the Great Release had made a decision of civilizational scope, and those of us living in it had inherited not just the consequences of that decision, but, in some sense, the decision itself. To open the vault without a new civilizational conversation about whether to open it was to impose on millions of living Vaishian knowledge they had not asked for, in the same way that the Resonant had once imposed on millions of Vaishi a feeling they had not asked for. This stopped me, and I think it stopped all of us. Because Sona's point was not about what the vault contained. It was about who had the right to decide whether it was opened. 9 guardians in a stone room in the mountains were not the Vaishi civilization. We were its custodians, but we were not it. The deliberation did not end in a decision to open or not to open. It ended in something I had not anticipated, but which, in retrospect, was inevitable, a decision to ask. Not everyone. Not in a grand ceremonial way that would require explaining everything before the question could be posed, but a small, careful, representative asking. A gathering of scholars, elders, artists, the people who form the tissue of our civilization's thinking, to whom we would present, in the most honest and careful way we could, the question of whether the civilization wished to know its own past. We would not tell them what the vault contained. We would tell them that it contained the records of the world as it was before the Great Release, including records of difficult things, things that the original ceremony had judged too dangerous to carry. We would ask them whether they wished those records to be opened. We would ask, and we would listen, and we would be bound by what we heard. I was given the task of organizing this asking, partly because it had been my investigation that had brought us to this point, and partly because I was the youngest and least feared, the one whose relationship to the Great Release was entirely inherited rather than experienced, who could speak about it with honesty and without the old flinching that still moved through the oldest guardians when the subject was raised directly. The asking took 4 months. I traveled to 14 cities. I sat with groups of scholars and artists and elders and young people in their first century of life who looked at me with entirely open eyes when I told them that the vault held things that our civilization had once decided were too dangerous to remember, and that the guardians wished to know whether civilization still felt this way. The conversations I had in those 4 months were among the most remarkable experiences of my life. I will describe only a few. In the city of Morel, a gathering of young artists, none older than 150 years, which is very young for the Vaishyi, received what I told them with a quality of alertness that I found both moving and slightly alarming. They wanted to know. Their desire was clean and uncomplicated. The desire of beings who have not yet had enough experience to develop the instinct for caution, they felt. And they were vivid and open about feeling, as young artists always are, that history belonged to them, that their civilization's past was theirs by right, and that the choice of the great release had been made for them without their consent, and that they wished it revised. I felt their feeling clearly, received it fully, and I also felt in myself a new kind of complexity. I agreed with their instinct, and I had reservations about their certainty. I am still not sure I resolved this well, but I listened and I recorded what they said. In a coastal village of elders, a place where the very old go when they want to be near each other and near the sea, where the air itself is heavy with compressed feeling of centuries, I sat with 8 Vaishyi, who were collectively over 5,000 years old between them, and I told them what I had been telling everyone else, and their response was entirely different from the young artists. They were quiet for a very long time after I had finished, and then the feeling they sent back, collectively, the layered compound of 8 ancient beings processing together, was the most complex emotional experience I've encountered. There was something in it I had to decode afterward at length. At its core, I think it was this: they already knew, in the way that the very old know things without knowing how they know them. Not the specific content, but the shape. The emotional shadow of it had been following them their whole lives, even erased, even gone, the shape of an absence that is exactly the shape of something that was there. They did not say they wanted the vault opened. They did not say they did not want it opened. They sent me a feeling that I think was, we have lived all our lives in the question of what we are without knowing what we came from. The not knowing has been our life. And we have made a life that is real and good. But you are asking whether we want to know, and we cannot say no to that question, not honestly, because the answer to that question is the oldest unanswered question inside each of us. In a middle-sized town called Velmirin, a place of scholars and craftspeople, and particular general ordinariness of civilization's middle register, I sat with a mixed group, young, old, middle-aged scholars and farmers, and one person who made the emotional imprint plates I had examined in the market almost a year ago. And what happened was not a conversation at all. What happened was that when I finished telling them what I had come to tell them, a silence fell, and in the silence someone began to cry. Not from sadness, exactly, or not only sadness. The crying had a more complex texture, grief and recognition together, the feeling of suddenly understanding a long-standing ache, the feeling of finally knowing why a particular note in a melody has always made something you go very still. The crying spread in the way things spread among the Vaishyi, the emotional current of it passing from person to person not as imitation, but as genuine resonance, each of them finding in themselves the thing the crying was about, each finding their own version of it. The room was full of people acknowledging, for the first time, a loss they had been carrying their whole lives without knowing what they were carrying. I cried too. I could not have done otherwise. I completed my rounds and returned to Velsorin and wrote my account of what I had found. And the account was long and complex, and I sent it to the 8 other guardians, and then I waited. The waiting was a month. Then I called them together again. The second meeting in the stone room was different from the first. The first had been a meeting of 9 beings confronting a question that had never been formally posed between them. The second was a meeting of 9 beings who had been living with that question for 4 months, who had read my account of the askings, who had spent their private months processing and preparing and deciding. We went around the circle. Each guardian spoke, felt their position in full. Merit had not changed her view entirely, but had modulated it. She still feared the vault. But she distinguished now between the vault's contents being available for scholarly study by those trained to handle them, and the vault's contents being broadly distributed. She could support controlled opening, by which she meant an opening that gave access to those who were equipped to contextualize and contain what they found, rather than a full release. Poe had moved further toward opening than before. His 4 months of living with a question had deepened his conviction that incompleteness was a form of ongoing injury, subtle and slow-moving but real. He was for opening with appropriate care, to remain where she had been, practically oriented, focus on the specific question of the techniques, which he felt needed to be known and named by those in positions of empathic leadership as a form of protection for the civilization. Sona had not changed her fundamental concern, the consent question, but had softened her position or perhaps clarified it after reading my account of the askings. She had been struck, as I had been, by the room in Velmirin and what had happened there. She was not yet yes, but she was no longer no. The others, Guardians Vesa, Horan, Paleth, and Tuvin himself, each carried their own specific textures of feeling and reasoning, and I will not render each at length because the meeting was long and the way of it does not reduce well into summary. What I can say is that after 3 hours of circling, we had found something, not full consensus. We had not all moved to the same position, but we had found something that felt like the shape of a possible way forward, a path that all 9 of us could walk even if we walked it from slightly different emotional starting points. We would open the vault, not to the general population, to a committee of scholars, specifically chosen scholars, people who demonstrated emotional stability and intellectual rigor in a particular capacity for holding difficult things without being destroyed by them, who would spend years studying the contents, who would produce, from those studies, a series of accounts, not the raw records, but accounts, contextualizing the records and explaining them and placing them in the frame of what they meant for a civilization that had lived 800 years without knowing this about itself. These accounts would eventually be made available, not all at once, not without support. The Guardians would establish, alongside the scholarly work, a network of empathic support practitioners, people trained in helping others process difficult historical understanding without being damaged by it, a kind of civilizational grief practice, prepared in advance, ready to receive the weight of the knowing when the knowing was released. It would take years, possibly decades. The vault had been sealed for 8 centuries. It could wait a few more years for the right opening. And when it was opened, when the accounts were prepared and the support structures were in place and the scholars had done their work, then the civilization would be invited, not required, given a choice, given full information about what the choice involved, invited to know. This was a decision we reached. All 9 of us, by the end of the 3rd hour, had placed ourselves on the path of it, however tentatively, however with reservations, however with a particular quality of commitment made, while fully feeling its weight. I held my piece of the key. It was amber-colored, irregular, cool in my hand. I had carried it for 3 years. I held it and looked at it and thought about the woman who had carried it before me, and the guardian before her, and the one before that, back through 800 years to the hands that had originally split the key and distributed it to 9 with the instruction that the vault could only be opened if all 9 agreed. All 9 agreed. We did not open the vault that day. That was not the plan. The plan was the scholars first, the preparation first, the care first. But we performed a small ceremony, the 9 of us, there in the stone room. We each brought out our piece of key and held it, and we let our feelings speak freely, all of them, the fear and the grief and the conviction and the relief and the grief again, and we held those feelings in common for a long time, and then we put the pieces back and went home. The vault opening happened 14 months later, in a ceremony attended only by the 9 guardians and the 12 scholars who had been selected and prepared. It was not a dramatic event in the physical sense. We brought the key pieces together and inserted them into the mechanism, which was very old and made a sound I had not expected, a low resonance like a deep note held, and the vault opened. Inside, the records, hundreds of thousands of preserved documents, shells of them, the entire history of a civilization that had thought itself too dangerous to know. Everything, their art, their literature, their science, their daily life, their records of the resonant, their accounts of what had been done, their descriptions of the neurological techniques, their documents of the decision to forget. The scholars went in. They spent the next 4 years inside, or moving between the vault and the world, processing what they found. The guardians maintained the structure of support. I visited often. I watched the scholars learn to carry what they were learning, watched them develop the emotional muscles required, watched them sometimes fail and need to step away for a month and come back, What they found, I knew in outline from Tuvin, but the specifics added depth and texture and complexity that changed things, as specifics always do. The Vaishi before the Great Release had not been simply oppressed and then liberated. They had been complex. The Resonant were not simply villains. They were Vaishi who had developed capacity that their culture had not known how to constrain, and who had over generations normalized the use of that capacity in ways that seemed, from inside the culture, simply like being naturally more persuasive, more appealing, more capable of making others feel good in their presence. The line between genuine charisma and manufactured feeling had been crossed so gradually, over so many generations, that most of those who crossed it had not known they were crossing it. This was, the scholars reported, in some ways more disturbing and in some ways more hopeful than the simpler narrative would have been. More disturbing because it suggested that the capacity for this kind of harm was not a property of particular bad actors, but a cultural environment that had not developed the right awareness and constraints. More hopeful because the scholars found, also in the vault, evidence that in the years immediately before the Great Release, the Vaishi had been doing something remarkable. They had been developing exactly that awareness, exactly those constraints. The Great Release had not been a retreat. It had been a choice made by a civilization that had already, in the moment of choice, become something better than what it had been. The accounts were written. They took 3 more years. The scholars were extraordinary. They held enormous weight and translated into forms that a general reader could encounter without being crushed. The Guardians reviewed the accounts. We worked with them, adjusting and refining, learning along the way about things we had not known even with our various levels of prior knowledge. And then the accounts were released. Not all at once. In a series spread over 2 years, with a support network already in place, with empathic practitioners available in every city and town, with the explicit framing that this was a choice. Anyone who did not wish to know could continue not to know, and there was no judgment attached to that choice. Most Vaishi chose to know. I watched my civilization learn about itself over those 2 years, and it was the most extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed. Not because it was smooth, it was not smooth. There were periods of enormous collective grief. The specific grief of learning that your ancestors were wronged in ways that touched the very core of what it means to be Vaishi. There were periods of anger, directed at no one living, but real anger, honest anger, the feeling of an injustice fully perceived. There were questions about whether current empathic practices should be audited in light of what had been learned. And this was perhaps the most difficult and most important conversation, the one where Trin's old concern about the techniques finally found its proper venue, where the civilization began developing, for the first time consciously, the frameworks for identifying and addressing the kind of subtle projection that had once been so normalized it seemed like merely being pleasant. But there was also something else, something I had not fully expected, and whose depth surprised me. There was recognition. The old woman in the market had hummed a melody she did not know she knew. The children of the first generation had drawn marks they did not know they were reproducing. The room in Velmirin had cried for a loss it could not name. All across the civilization, the Vaishi had been carrying, in ways they could not see or identify, the ghost of what they had lost. The not knowing had not made them empty. It had made them haunted by a specific and nameable thing. And when they learned what the thing was, when the grief had a name and a shape and a history, something happened that none of the Guardians had predicted and none of the scholars had promised. It got lighter, not gone, not resolved, but lighter. The carrying of a named weight is different from the carrying of an unnamed one, and the Vaishi discovered this collectively, in their empathic way, as a shared experience of something lifting. Tuvin told me, in the months after the release of the first accounts, that he felt something he had not felt in 900 years. I asked him to show me, and he did, and what he showed me was a feeling I recognized from that first day in Velmirin, the room full of people crying for a loss they could not name. Except that Tuvin's version of it was the same feeling from the other side. The feeling not of a loss finally named, but the stone over the spring finally moved. The feeling of weight set down. The feeling of something that has been held for a very long time at last released. He was 900 years old, and he was crying, and it was genuinely all right. I went back to the market of El Soren in the second year of the release, on a morning that was the same color as that first morning had been. Deep water sky, faint moons, the emotional weather of hundreds of my people moving through their ordinary lives. I walked through the crowd and felt it, as I had always felt it. The joy from the children and the crystals, the quiet grief in the far corner, the accumulated warmth of a civilization that has spent 800 years learning, without knowing it was doing so, to simply feel each other honestly. It was the same, and it was different. It was the same warmth, the same genuine connection, the same real trust between beings who had built something beautiful, without knowing the full story of why it mattered that they built it. But now there was a new texture to it, barely perceptible, available to those who knew to feel for it, a thread of something that had not been there before, something that ran through the ordinary warmth like a deeper current. The feeling of knowing where you came from, the feeling of a civilization that had survived something terrible in the old time before memory and had spent 800 years building the opposite of that terrible thing, and had now learned what it had built and why and at what cost. A civilization that knew its own name. Finally, a civilization that could look at itself fully. I stood in the market, and I let this current run through me, and my visible biology moved in ways I could not control, and did not want to control. The deep blue of significance shifting to something warmer, the channels of my circulatory system carrying a light that I understood, in that moment, as the light of someone who has done the work she was meant to do. Somewhere in the crowd, someone was humming. The melody was the old one, the one I had first heard from the old woman, the one that had started everything, the angular melody from before the great release that had lived in old throats for 8 centuries without knowing its own name. But it was different now. It was no longer unconscious, no longer the haunting of a ghost that did not know it was a ghost. It was a choice. Someone in the market of El Soren, who had read the accounts and learned the history, and grieved what there was to grieve, was singing the old melody on purpose, in the full daylight, as an act of deliberate remembrance. I added my voice to it. I did not know all the words. No one knew all the words yet. The scholars were still working on a full translation, but I knew the melody, had known it for over a year, and I sang it as I moved to the market, and others who recognized it joined, and others who did not recognize it felt the emotional current of it and slowed and listened, and the melody moved the crowd the way everything moves through us, not by force, not by manufacture, but by genuine resonance, one feeling, touching another until the whole space was filled with it. The Vaishi, feeling their full history for the first time in 800 years. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.